this webinar will be recorded and it will be uploaded to the IPEM conference's YouTube following the webinar. We're going to be using Slido for the Q&A session at the end. So on the next slide, there will be a QR code and a code that if you can ask your questions in there, and please make use of the upvote or like feature to raise any questions that you particularly want answered, and we'll try our best to get to them. I'll also ask if there's any of the existing SIG members on the chat when we get to the discussion, if you could stick your camera on and join in, and that way we can get some different experiences from different trusts. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Adam, who's going to talk to us about IT service management and how to talk IT. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Alistair. Trying to get into the right slide mode, and hopefully you can all hear me.
Yep, can hear you fine.
Excellent, brilliant. Okay, so today's webinar, we're going to talk over something called IT service management, which is, I'm going to explain what that means and hopefully how it has relevant to your departments and how it can hopefully help us to talk better with IT departments and to try and manage those relationships. This work's come out of the last symposium that we had, where one of the discussions we had at the end of that was over different ways to talk to IT and how that was one of the biggest barriers that we often find. How do we actually improve that engagement with them? So hopefully this is something which can help. So what am I going to talk through? So I'm going to start over with just a really quick introduction of what actually is IT service management. Why should we actually care about it? And then what resources we can get which might make our lives easier so we can understand it better, and then a bit of a deeper dive into what it's all about. And then finally, how have I used it in our department? So what actually is it? Well, this is from an ITSM resource that I'll explain a bit later, but this is the opening slide that they have. And they say that basically IT realized in the 80s that actually the greatest majority of problems that they encountered in service outtime was due to human factors, so either people or processes. And so there was an initiative essentially to introduce something that helped control that. And this work is largely similar to what has happened in the medical world, and it's definitely in medical physics with the introduction of, for example, quality management systems in radiotherapy. So hopefully the rationale for using it for IT is pretty clear, because we use the same arguments when we explain why we need something like this for managing our services. So IT service management aims to provide high quality IT services, and it aims to achieve this through the definition and establishment and maintenance of processes. So hopefully that seems familiar to anyone who's had an introduction into QMSs. So that's great. Why should we care about IT's processes? So one of the major things that we've discussed is that it's quite hard for us to get engagement sometimes with trust and hospital IT. And looking at it from an IT point of view, IT is represented on the board, and if anything goes wrong and any risks that happen with IT, the first thing the board will do is we'll look at corporate IT, and that's how they believe it should be. However, other groups and other services may be performing IT functions, and this may be creating what the IT will perceive as risks. So they term this, or it has been termed shadow IT, grey IT, autonomous IT. There's lots of different names for it, depending on how well organized it is and how much engagement it has. And the risks they kind of think is that we could introduce new cyber security risks, we could be losing IG and data, and we could be creating reputational damage if we knock systems out. So that's the kind of risks that they see us and autonomous IT providing. So how do we address this? Well, being good, technical competence is a very important thing. However, that tends often to be interpersonal. So somebody in IT knows somebody in our groups and they know that they do the job well. And when they leave, you've got to rebuild those relationships. So some ways we can help that is through having management engagement and control processes. So not only that they know that one person in our team does it well, but the whole team does it well. And we have processes that show that we're controlling it, and that's built in from the management down. And the other thing, therefore, to do that is to have a knowledge of those processes, what they use, and therefore it's communication, knowing what they call things. And sometimes what they call things is not plain English, in a very similar way to, again, quality in the quality management term might not be what the plain English definition of quality is. So trying to bridge those two things is one rationale between having an idea, at least, of what the IT's management processes are. And another thing is for ourselves that actually some of these processes might be useful. So within medical physics and clinical engineering, we've often talked about parts of this life cycle. So this I hear is a very high level. Hopefully you've all seen something similar, the DevOps model of a model of how a piece of software is entered and used into the clinical environment or any environment. So we have some requirements, we plan it, we build it, we validate it, release it, and then we deploy it, use it, operate, monitor it until it changes, and then either decommission or rebuild it. And inside IPEM and MPACE, we've often considered the EU MDR and how that impacts to this first part, with a very little bit overlapping on the monitoring for post-market surveillance. Now with the DCBs, we've got more things into scope with this first part, things that wouldn't necessarily be considered medical devices. DCB 0160 also covers over the deploy and release, but we still have some gaps here in the operate and monitor, where actually having some processes to do this might be useful. And again, these are the two things, therefore, that I think are why we should know something about IT systems, is maybe they'll be useful and it'll help hopefully build communication with IT services. So we need to consider that whole life cycle. I've just flagged in here a little reference to ISO 81001, which is also trying to do this same thing, looking at the life cycle of health IT systems, which may be useful, but I'm not going to cover that in any detail. So what's it all about? What resources are there that we can use? So ITSM started really, or the earliest thing I can find is ITIL, and that's the one that is the biggest framework for doing IT service management. And this dates back to the 1980s when it was a UK-backed initiative. It was then owned by Axelos, and Axelos has recently been bought out. And Axelos is also the company that does Prince2. And this is a best practice guidance. So it's something that individuals get certified against rather than departments. So following ITIL, there was ISO 20000, and this is based heavily on ITIL, but then wrapped around an ISO 9001 kind of QMS. So it can be kind of thought of the same thing as ISO 9001 plus the ITIL. So trying to make a standard that an organization can be certified against to show that the organization does it. And in the UK, there's something called Ticket Plus, which is the UCAS that accredits these two things. And it can also have ISO 27001 built in. So these two are quite heavyweight, large sets of processes which represent both practice and a standard. And then after that, there's been several other initiatives. One of them I'm going to mention is FIT Service Management, which is the Federated IT Service Management. I'm going to use this quite a bit because this is a lightweight version. So it's hopefully got far fewer processes and therefore it's easier to discuss. And they're usually the core ones. And this is an EU-backed initiative, and therefore the resources are all helpfully available for under the Creative Commons. And then there are lots of others. For example, the Microsoft Operations Framework, which people in IT might go through, and that's again derived from ITIL, but very specific to Microsoft, and many others. The list goes on. So just quickly to give you an idea of how they all fit together, ISO 20000 is based on 9000. It uses ideas from ITIL, and both of these together have been built together. This FIT SM essentially has used ideas from both of these to create its own platform, which is an open one that we can actually look at for free. One little bit that I'm going to just put us aside in is this idea of CMMI, which is the capability maturity model. This is an alternative to ISO 9000, where often the ISO standards must conform to some minimum requirements. A lot of the other frameworks use the idea of process maturity. So rather than having it must do this at this level, which is usually around quantitatively managed for an ISO, they have the idea that your processes might have a different level of maturity, and you might want to at least quantify where your processes are. So the first step being actually realizing you have some processes, but you're not actually controlling them, all the way up to you've got processes that you've measuring, you're managing, and you're trying to improve constantly. So, as I said, from a history point of view, in the 1980s, this came out of the UK Central Computer and Telecom Agency, is what was the group that used a lot of operations engineering type research at the time to come up with these ideas. And then in the late 80s, ITIL version 1 came around. This was then revised in 2001, 2007, and that's when FitSM was brought in as part of that. And then most recently, ITIL version 4 has been released, which was in 2019. This reflects that IT has changed, so it's got some revisions to include lean, agile, DevOps, etc. But it's also moved towards a more general, rather than just IT service management approach. I put this slide in to show that actually the standard I'm probably going to go through the most here is the FITSM one, and that actually is based on a slightly older version. And as expected, when you have something like this, the number of processes has increased with time. So in the version 2, there was 10, version 3, 26. 2000 only used the core processes from that one. And that has grown and grown and grown until the latest version, you've got over 34 practices. And I don't really want to go through those in any detail, so I'm just going to look at the core ones, the ones that are common to all of them. I think that's... So when we look at the different things, so ISO, when we look at ISO 20000, it's 8th in the rankings essentially of the different ISO standards. And so every year ISO does an assessment of how many certificates have been issued by the different worldwide accreditation bodies. So you can see that it's not very big fry, especially not in the UK. 20,000 is not highly used in the UK. However, the ITIL ones are used more frequently without that full accreditation. It's interesting for me that 9,000 is just so much more than all the rest. But we're doing quite well in 27,000. That's one of the ones that's probably coming up in the UK more than other countries. For me, well, this is just why I'm talking about it. I've done some of the training courses. I've done 2 of them. So this is the ITIL training scheme. You start with foundation, then you've got these practitioner levels in the middle of different ones, which is different focus on different sets of processes. So these ones are all to do strategic management, and these ones are all to do with operational. And then there are some very specific ones. And then once you've done these, you can become an ITIL master. I'm not there, but it's something that it's interesting that you can do these courses, and that's how they make their money. So ITIL is quite protective, shall we say, of their resources. Whereas when you look at the FITSM one, it has a similar process, similar set of training material. However, the training resources are all available. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, the training resources. I'm going to do a very, very quick overview, which is roughly around just below the foundation level. However, if you want to go and get more information, they make them quite openly available. So without further ado, I'm going to dive a little bit more into actually what's in one of these standards. So within the FITSM one, there is a essential parts, which are the overview and vocabulary list and some requirements. There's 80 of key terms and 82 requirements. And then there are a set of things that help build upon that and some implementation aids. So that's the core standard with some implementation aids. The first thing that the standard says is, with many of these standards, it's very similar to ISO 9000. You need some policy at the top level. You need some processes which then span across different departments, different roles, and then you have procedures, which are the things that you follow on a day-to-day basis. And the reason for this is because in my earlier slide, I said corporate IT is one body. If your trusts are anything like ours, under that corporate IT banner, there are many, many subdivisions, and each trust probably are going to have a different way of splitting these up into different parts. And these processes have to work across it. So they have to have some engagement at that top level to make sure that the processes work across their groups. So the general processes that are in this standard are a set of general ones, which are management type ones, and then some ITSM specific ones, which are the detail, these 14. These 7 largely look the same as ISO 9000 or any other high harmonized standard, and they are, I'm not intending to go through those in any detail, but they are basically the overall top level management responsibility, having some idea of planning and supporting and then evaluating and improving your services. And this is nothing different to ISO 9000. So hopefully then we can agree that those aren't particularly of interest, and then we can move into the ones that are slightly more interesting. And they divide those into 2 types. You've got the ones at the top in purple here, which are to do with planning. And these are strategic focus, how you're actually going to plan your IT service, relationships, externally facing things. And then you've got the operations and control, how are you actually going to run it on a day-to-day basis. So if we look at the first set of the service design processes, these start with the definition of what do I actually mean when we say service for an IT point of view. And again, most of them, like ITIL and ITSM, they all have slightly different definitions, but a service is basically a way of doing something that the customer wants. So it's some way of producing a service for users. So for IT, example would be, say, providing desktops, doing connectivity, providing any specialist or standard application storage. That kind of thing is when we talk about a service, and that's what they mean. So when we talk about these processes, we have 3 processes, one of which is maintaining new services and the existing services. So it's how do you control when a service is being developed and released to your customers, essentially. Service level management, which is how do you actually agree with your customers what quality they want of service and which services you're going to let them use, because you might have services that you don't use, or they're only internal, they're not available for all customers, because obviously this deals with IT services that cover a lot of them. And mainly when you have, for example, third-party IT working with hospitals now, they might only provide a certain number of these to your hospital. And then there's final reporting, making sure that you actually do what you say you do. Some key definitions is service portfolio. So IT should be keeping a list of what they actually do and the life cycle of what services are available, and then how those services composed. And from that, they create a service catalog. So that's probably what you'll see when you look on your help desk. You'll see what actually can you get off IT, which might not be everything that they offer. And then the customer will be hopefully agreeing some service level agreements. In hospitals, I think it's fair to say probably that this might be quite woolly sometimes, and how well they are, and other hospitals might have it much tighter. Underneath your service level agreements, you might also have operational agreements, which are essentially for bits of your service, what sub agreements do you need in order to hit that service level agreement. But this again should be something that's happening inside IT. So if IT are providing you with a service, they need to make sure that the components of that service make that feasible, that the level that they've promised is feasible. And again, we have something here which is just doing some reports that may or may not go to the customer to allow you to control this. So that's when they talk about those service portfolio management, service level management, and service reporting, that they're the composition of those. So when's it going to affect you? Well, you're likely not to need this on a day-to-day basis. However, when you're requesting something new, i.e., can you host some new software for me, you might end up bouncing into this process, depending on how they've defined their services. So they may say that actually this is a new service we're doing and we need to go through this whole process. So what would that mean? That they'll probably have inside your service portfolio management process, there will be something that says can we actually do this? So there will be a whole nother level of governance that says, do we actually want to do this as an IT department? Can we resource it? If you're I've said here that the process is unlikely in-house. I'm not saying it's impossible. Our trust certainly is starting to become more rigorous about this process and not saying yes to everything. They're trying to say, can we put things in? Can we have other meetings that say, actually, we want to review this and say whether or not we want to do this? So this might happen. But when you're dealing with third-party IT, or when you're looking at clouds or anything as a service, this is more likely that you'll have to be involved with this and have an understanding. And then the main take home is that you need to make sure that actually the SLAs that you're agreeing and they're offering actually fit what you need for a clinical point of view. So those are the design ones. The next ones are the support processes. So we've got three here again. We've got availability and continuity management, which is to do with making sure that the service is available and can meet the needs of those targets. You've got capacity. That means you want to have enough equipment, resources, etc., IT resources to make sure that you can meet the requirements, and then you've got to make sure that it's safe. So they define two definitions of availability and continuity. Availability is, can you actually ensure that any downtime through normal, and when I say normal, I mean things like that are highly likely to happen in general IT usage, where you define that may differ, but for example, hard drives will fail, parts of your system will fail and have planned obsolescence built into them. So you need to make sure that this is accounted for. So that's your availability. And you may also need to think about doing updates. So you need to plan how updates and operating system updates are going to impact this. So that's how you deal with that. Whereas continuity is the exceptional, the floods, the fires, the big events, the crises, and that's a similar, but you need to think about what's the minimum level of service that people are going to accept when we've had something bad happening. And if that's nothing, you've got to obviously specify a system that's far more resilient to that. Capacity hopefully speaks for itself, but it's basically making sure you have enough of the systems, the licenses, the hard drives, everything that allows you to manage that service. And so that is something that you need to agree up front, and you need to make sure that you have that for a certain period until the next update to make sure it happens. And I'm not going to massively talk about ISM because we've had several recent webinars about security, but this is basically trying to ensure that the confidentiality, integrity and availability of your data is maintained, i.e. it's not being accessed by other people who aren't authorized, it's not damaged by or modified by people who don't have access, and it's available when somebody needs to use it. So that's the three guides for that. But this has become a large enough field that there is an entirely separate standard, so I'm not going to talk about that much. So when should we be considering these processes? Again, these are when you're thinking about specifying a new service. So when you're talking to IT and you need to specify a service, you need to think about what availability you need and what is your contingency targets for that system. And the normal things should apply. You want to have resilient, redundant architectures, and you want to avoid single points of failures. But it is important, or becoming more important, to consider planned downtime and how you're going to manage that. For capacity, well, predictions are actually challenging. I think that's an understatement. Trying to work out what you need in 5 years when your service is changing is going to be quite tricky to do. So ideally, you want to be looking at, can you get flexible infrastructures to mean that you can actually grow if you get those numbers wrong? And again, with ITSM, we've discussed this at length over the last few webinars. They're all available online for you to review. Network segregation, I think, is Bob's key message from the last one. And the final two of these high-level strategic ones are relationship management with customers and suppliers, and I'm not going to say anything here because they pretty much mirror what you see in ISO 9001. They are basically defining you have customers and you have users, which are slightly different, and then you have suppliers, and you should manage the relationships with them. You should have some processes to say how you do that. There's nothing much there. So then hopefully the more interesting ones. are the operations processes. So these are probably the oldest of the processes that are in ITIL. They were around since ITIL v2, and these are the ones that actually define how you're going to manage a system on a day-to-day basis and how you're going to look after things. And these, again, are interrelated. So you start with your incidents and service desks, and a user can raise either one, an incident or a request. And your request should hopefully just be simple things that fulfill one of these services. And then you have an incident. And the incident is something's gone wrong. What's gone wrong? A computer stopped talking, a computer's not talking to a server, the hard drive's broken, it's not booting, something like that's an incident. And your incident response process is to look at dealing with that incident and getting them working as fast as possible. However, if you have a few of these incidents, you end up dropping into this problem management. So several incidents might mean that you have a problem that you need to look around. And then you'll be thinking, well, how do I do a workaround for this? So is it a known problem? And how can I therefore have a workaround that solves that? And eventually, hopefully, you might actually think, oh, actually, we want a solution. And that's going to generally going to raise a request for something to change. And a change is anything changing on your system, which is the core almost of most of these processes. You're going to have a change made on your IT infrastructure. So you need somebody to check and approve that change. So you have a change authority whose job it is to approve these changes. And once you've done that, you release the change. And then you've got this slightly interesting process here, which is configuration management, which is how do you create a record of all of the bits that make up your service. So that's the high level view. So incident and request, as I've briefly talked through, an incident comes in, you register it on a service desk, you classify it, you prioritize it, you analyze it, you then either escalate it if it's a problem or need to go somewhere else, or you can solve it through different levels. This is where all the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 levels come out of IT. If it's required, escalate it, hopefully resolve it, and then close it. So again, this is trying to get the operation back to normal, not trying to solve the problem, trying to get the service back, or trying to fulfill a service request. So that's one set of the groups. A problem, if you've got patterns of these occurrences, that's when you raise a problem. And that's something where you're actually going to look at, well, can I investigate the root cause? Can I identify a workaround? Can I solve it? Can I change something to mean that problem's never going to occur again? And that's when you end up with a request for change, and we go into the change management process. So they are slightly different. And one of the core things is that it's built into the system is that isolated incidents may not be investigated in the problem. And that's an interesting thing, that actually, if it's just something that turning it off and on again fixes, maybe we'll keep that and that'll do. That's fine. But it's from my point of view, as somebody looking at this process, is objectively, actually, once you've told somebody to turn it off and on again, they might keep doing that, and then it will never get really solved. You might stop reporting them because we all know that going into service desk is a bit of a bottleneck. So we might end up never having a true idea of how many occurrences we have of that issue. So how does this affect me? Well, based on that being a bottleneck, let's make it clear and unambiguous when we put in a request. Say if we've got an incident, say if we've got a problem. If we can, say how many times it's occurred, highlight it's a problem, give them other ticket numbers. Do their job essentially, but it might help you. So you make them really easy to request. One of the things I find very useful is to put for the attention of, once you know the IT structure, it helps to know where you're trying to send a ticket or a request to. Configuration management. So this is basically trying to keep a logical model of what you've got in your system. So ITSM breaks it down into services, service components, and configuration items. What is that? So a service might be operating a treatment planning system. You might have an SQL database as one of your service components. You might have remote access, such as Citrix, to access it. You might have a DICOM server as a separate bit. And then your configuration items, they're actually the little bits. So that might be this server provides the SQL functionality. So you've got a configuration item, which is the software for the SQL, one for the the actual server that does it, and that allows you to break them down into bits, and then you need to keep a record of those. So this is really unlikely to affect us on a day-to-day basis. However, it might be useful to consider it for your own department, some form of essentially tracking of how your services are built up and what they do. And a lot of IT services use automated tools. And when you use automated tools, this causes friction because you can't install it in your medical devices. So they might want to be installing things to track your assets. But if you can gain access to one of those things, that might be useful for you. So that's something worth keeping in mind. Change management. Again, once you've had a request, you register it, you classify it, and then you move into the approval process. From here, you move into implementing that change and then reviewing it. The types of changes, basically, the types of changes, I'll probably start with that bit. There are 3 common types of changes: normal changes, standard changes, which are basically standardized ones that follow a pre-approved process, and emergency changes. So they're the 3 common types of changes that you'll see and be talked about. And some of these may be defined further into like small, large, major, minor, for different sizes of change. Is it going to affect one department, or is it going to affect the whole hospital? From these, you will have different approval mechanisms, which are commonly called change authorities, of which the most common one that everyone hopefully is aware of or will be aware of is something called Change Advisory Board. But you might have other ones, such as an Emergency Change Advisory Board, which happens only for those, or you might have one for minor projects. So the group of people here are the ones necessary to approve that change from an IT perspective and make a decision on whether that change is suitable to go ahead. Common to this process, there will be a change log, which actually registers upcoming changes. Again, this is something worth having a sight on if you can get access to that in your IT department, because you can see what's going to affect what you're doing, potentially. There's usually quite a lot of them, though, so it's quite a lot of work to keep track of. And a lot of other processes will raise changes, because this is the core process of making sure that when things happen on your network, it's a controlled change. And then release is hopefully something you're all really good at anyway, and that is actually looking at how am I actually going to release a change in the IT infrastructure. So planning it, making sure you've got some acceptance tests to make sure that that change doesn't break, another review process to make sure that those plans work, some form of further deployment planning and preparations, and then the final deployment and final changes which go back in. So you see that there is this difference between the change, which is, can you approve just making that change, and then the actual second set of review go no on actually releasing that. So the idea here is to potentially even bundle changes together that you can make together, which affect multiple changes. So when will this affect me? It's a very common process, I think, on most trusts. So it's likely to be required whenever you're making changes to something that IT have sight of. I'm doing one this week. I'm going to change board for our Mosaic upgrade. So that's one of the things where we have to go through it. It's really useful to understand the IT local processes and timelines, because otherwise it can be a bottleneck. So you need to make sure everything's ready for their process. And that access to a change log might help you, if you have time to review what IT are making, make you anticipate issues that are coming up. So, and I say you might need to represent the change at a CAB meeting. And release management is likely what you're already doing, and the plans to do this may or may not, depending on your system, form part of that CAB. They might have a 2-stage or a single stage. And then there's the final one of those processes is continuing improvement, which again, there is nothing more to add than ISO 9001. You should be having something to demonstrate it. So I've chucked in a few bonus ones. These are ones that do not fit in the FIT SM model. IT asset management, which is basically tracking your assets. So that's hardware and software mostly, to maximize its value. This is probably a better name, but usually has some overlap with that configuration management. Although it's the idea that not all configuration items are actually assets. They might be something else. And then you have event management, which is monitoring events. And I think the last webinar we talked about checking essentially for security events, so host intrusion detection, where we look for things happening on your boxes. That's an example of that. And then that raises alerts, which then can go into problem management. It's similar to configuration management. A lot of these processes will be automated. And again, they do cause friction with medical devices, potentially if they want to install things onto services that you don't want them to be installed on, or that the vendor says cannot be installed onto them. But again, it might be useful if they are available for you to have access to for your own systems. And asset management is something we should already be doing, because we should be maintaining our inventories. And the latest IRMA 224 update also includes software into that and moves that into scope. Ooh. And that's not very good, Adam. Oh, sorry, I've lost a slide here. I realize that. Sorry, architecture. So this essentially is, there is another process, a new one, which is defining enterprise architectures. So a lot of IT services are recognizing that they want to have common solutions across their entire landscape of their software. So the idea is essentially to not have 4 different virtualization platforms in one hospital, not have 3 or 4 different accesses to remote access services, so not having Citrix and terminal services. Pick one and stick with it across the whole IT architecture. So the IT architecture management approach is to have another body that sits as part of the service design that says, actually, are we using common solutions to problems, and can we ensure? However, that's a great idea, but we can't do that in our computing department, because different medical device software only seem to be certified for limited stacks, limited groups of hardware and software products. So that makes it quite tricky to do if they're only going to be certified for that limited group, to try and get that benefit of consolidation. It's also another approval process we see coming in, that actually we have an architects group that is reviewing our design decisions when we look at bringing in new software, and that's trying to reduce our reliance on other software to try and centralize. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the processes. As I said, there's a bunch of other resources I'm sharing that hopefully you can see if you need more information about those processes. But how have we used it? So I work at the clinical computing group at Birmingham. We have been part of ISO 9001 for our radiotherapy services since 2019. And we essentially offer one service. We don't have a service portfolio. We basically manage radiotherapy systems and data, and that's including ones we've built in-house. And we map our processes to these 4 stages of a system's life cycle. One day I'll move that to the Infinity DevOps sign in a future update of our scope, but we basically say that we go around it again when something changes after this maintenance. It's either decommissioning or an update. And to support that, we've used an open source IT service management tool, which we use for our record management. So thinking about these processes is quite useful. So our processes, we have defined about 12, which is risk management, project management, that continuity and availability and contingency, requirements in-house, procurement, information management, verification and validation, asset management, release management, problem and incident management, system management, monitoring, and change management. So you can see from those processes that we've actually brought in some of those ITSM processes into what we do. And I've color-coded those in blue. We've also got ones that we're more common and more used to talking about, which are to do with in-house software development. So we've brought some of those in, although I've split some out because we want to do requirements analysis, whether we build it in-house or whether we procure it. And we want to do testing, whether we built it in-house or whether we want to procure it. And then we have a couple of other ones which fulfill that information security management, which I personally put under risk management, but there's also some ongoing looking after the data on a day-to-day basis and making sure people have access to it. So we've used ITSM through ours. So as I say, I'm going to change board this week, so I'm going to pick one. So this is our process, our internal one for change. We we don't use the term standard change because I don't like it. I use routine change, which I think is slightly clearer, because the difference between standard and normal is slightly deliberately obfuscated, I think. And we've also got how do we have a review at the end of a normal change to actually say, well, are we going to need it more than once? And we also in our process defer this up, if possible, to a change authority. So if it's a high risk change, then we'll send this up to the change board and we'll interface with the IT one. However, if it's a low risk, then we'll be doing our approval process inside and just inside our group. So we've hopefully divided up how we interface with high risk IT systems and how we do internal ones. So this is GLPI. It's not an endorsement, I say, but it's how we use it. It's quite a useful system. For us, it's heavily based on ITSM processes. So for example, it has a concept of a change. It allows you to do the risk assessment very easily. It allows you to do a plan for how we're going to release it quite easily. It's built-in approval process, so we can approve it and we have a record of who's approved those changes. And we can link it to lots of other projects, or we can link it to problems, and we can link it to potentially other tickets for people who have requested the change. And we can also importantly link it to all the different assets that make up our systems. So that's just a quick summary of what we do at Birmingham and how it looks. And what we found that's helped us. So actually we found that adopting ITSM processes actually sped up our implementation. They are quite usefully abstracted. They are quite abstract processes, but that actually is quite useful. So rather than having the concept of a work instruction for every workaround, which could lead us with hundreds and hundreds of documents, or a work instruction for every change that we might make, we can have those abstracted away as changes, and the processes are just how we create those other records. It allowed us to have quite easy integration with that off-the-shelf tool, which we quite liked. And recently it satisfied an external IT audit, which was useful, that our medical physics equipment was audited via an external IT auditor, and they were happy because a lot of the terms that we used therefore aligned with what was on their tick lists and what they were looking for. So that made it very useful. We've only really, though, adopted, as I showed you, the basic core processes, but recently, as I've probably said throughout, our IT is becoming slightly more ITIL focused, following a recent leadership change, a recent-ish leadership change. And I think this helps us to understand those changes a little bit better. Another downside, though, however, is that the tools used tend to focus on tickets and ticket throughput, which we then adopted for KPI. And that actually came out of a BSI audit. They wanted to make us sure that we've got tickets. Are we controlling how fast they go through? And maybe that's not actually what matters. Goes back to the adage, what you measure matters, but are you actually measuring what matters? And by adopting these processes, it probably doesn't really help to separate CSC from IT, but it means that our IT processes and bits that we do that are probably more IT-centric are slightly more in line with what trusts do. So in summary, ITSM represents best practice for running an IT service. Your hospital IT is not going to adopt probably a whole framework or standard, but if you are a manager of an IT service and you're looking for best practice, you're going to come across these services and these processes. So they're going to definitely influence your internal processes. So hopefully what I've done is introduce some of the core processes and vocabulary that's used and highlighted how this can help aid communication. And maybe these are things that can be introduced into your CSC services, or even into radiotherapy services or other services. Essentially having an instant process is a reasonable idea, and when IT then audit, you've got one that covers both. And hopefully I've therefore signposted here just some extra free resources and things that you can access to get some more information of that if you're interested. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. That was a really interesting high-level talk on IT service management. I'm sure there's plenty of homework we could go off and do and read lots of additional resources. So I think if anyone from the SIG is in the chat, could you stick your camera on and join in with the discussion? And whilst we're doing that, we've got one question already in the chat, Adam. And it says, do you think being certified would add an extra layer to your communications with IT. So I think that's more being certified. Does that mean that when IT look at you adding your requests, extra level of respect, extra level of understanding that you know what you're talking about?
So I guess this comes down to as an individual, I don't tell them that I'm currently certified over ITIL. I can imagine that would be something that certain people do put that in their SIGs when they're IT. I've seen it certainly in the SIGs of some people that they've got what level of ITIL they've been trained to. I personally don't, so I'm not sure. I think it could. I think if you, as a department, having those processes in place and having that management potentially is more important. That actually you've got management buy-in, you've got processes that conform. So when they look at you, they are seeing that you're doing things at an organizational level correctly, if that makes sense, that rather than an individual. That's always the problem with individual things is so-and-so in IT knows you and knows you do a good job. It's helpful for you, and that's probably useful if there's only one of you in a department looking after it. But if you're trying to get continuity when you've left or if you've changed, it's less helpful. So I think it's probably a good start, but it could be better. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Do you have any views?
Hey, I'm not sure it would. I think a lot of, like you said in one of your early slides, a lot of interaction with IT comes down to interpersonal relationships, for better or worse. I think that's built up over time, and I think, yeah, if they knew you had good processes and see you represented at change board and know what you're talking about, that does more than having a really good QMS document that outlines the process, and it shows you're following it. Jack or Robert, do you have anything to add? Oh, Robert, you're still on mute there. You're used to team Zoom's a big difference, isn't it? I find it. Still can't hear you, I'm afraid, Robert.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Very much down to personal relationships. I find it's who you know in IT and how well they know the services you do. So I'm in radiotherapy, and a lot of people don't know what radiotherapy is and what our systems are. They think it's very much things like ARIA, the Oncology Information System. They think it's just a paper record tracking system or a electronic paper record system. They don't know what a medical device is, and they'll say, yeah, we're used to dealing with medical devices. We deal with PACS and Infoflex and things like that, but those aren't medical devices. And how we work, the things we do, even things like being an MPE, they've no idea what being an MPE is. So then they're potentially saying things like, you know, the clinical safety officer needs to sign off on our medical devices because, you know, what if we misposition a patient, for example, because the computer said the amount was wrong? And it's like, well, that's my job as an MPE and my understanding of it to gauge that and work out the risks. But he's saying, no, I'm the CSO. It's up to me to gauge that. And it's like, but that's not your scope as a CSO. Under the DCBs, you don't determine whether a medical device is safe or not. And those sorts of conversations are increasing quite rapidly. And what I'm not been very successful at is actually communicating who we are and how we do things and what our profession that is and our registrations. And I think partly just my limitations, but also these are very senior people dealing with many different things across many aspects of the trust. And there's only so much attention span they can give to something like me and radiotherapy. And it quickly sort of goes in one ear and out the other because we are quite atypical across the rest of the trust. No one else has things like ARIA, which we pretty much look after ourselves. You think something like PACS, which is used widely in the trust and is led by radiology, but very integrated with IT and the vendors. Whereas in radiotherapy, we tend to be much more standalone. And that's served us well over the years, but I think now we are really coming up against a governance a change in governance structures that means it's not working because we're not visible to the rest of the trust, and we kind of have to comply with their governance regulations, but they don't have to tell us what those governance regulations are. And it's a very interesting and difficult time I'm finding at the moment, and I have no particular answers. So yeah, very good to see the sort of more detailed IT perspective that Adam gave there. and also reassuring that you are saying it's a lot of who you know, because it means we're not an outlier, at least a problem shared and all that. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a common problem at the moment with a lot of the hats we're wearing in medical physics and clinical engineering, between CSO, medical device expert, having IT responsibilities. There's quite a lot that you'd have to represent, and I don't think we're necessarily represented at the high enough level, and the governance structures are still very one way, and that's one thing we need to try and change. And that leads on to one of the other questions that's popped up in the chat. Oh, Jack, do you want to jump in before I move on?
Just one point, which was about it's who you know and stuff, but it's also if you can get them to come down, IT to come down and just see what's going on in your radiotherapy department, it does help. I know here at Leeds, every so often IT want to take more control, take more sort of like responsibility for the medical devices here. So they get invited down, they come for a tour. They start off the tour with lots of questions, and as the tour goes on, they get quieter and quieter and quieter. And by the end of the tour, they understand better why radiotherapy manages the ICT so closely, and the jobs that we do to protect things. And I think that's very important.
Do you think, I'm going to play devil's advocate, do you think that if you had a system that mimicked theirs, they would have that trust better? If you showed them that actually we've got these processes here that align with yours, would that help?
Potentially, yeah. I think part of it is just for them to see the complexities in person. Seeing the system, they go, "Oh, you got a system, but we still want that doesn't change how much we want to install antivirus on your Linux and stuff like that." It's seeing it all in person, I think, makes it real.
Thanks, guys. So the next question was on the friction for medical devices. So medical device friction is often caused by technical understanding or lack of technical understanding from IT, I assume this means. So whilst the personal relationships there can help smooth the wheels, what advice do you have on bridging that gap? Have you had any really good examples where you've went to IT with a new medical device and managed to, like you say, Jack, get them down in the department, or anything else?
I think that it is just a case of trying to work through those. This is why we have to do it, and having a vendor thing that says you cannot install this is very helpful. Often when the vendor is trying to be helpful and saying actually you can do it, but it's at your own risk, that's when I find is the most difficult to have those questions and conversations, because as we've said, IT doesn't understand those risks, and that's our job to try and explain that to them.
Yeah, I agree. Having the vendor in can really help to have that discussion directly. But the question there does say, although personal relationships help, they cannot overcome the technical challenges. I've found if I explain exactly what it is that the medical device is doing and why that is a risk, it's very much dependent on the person I'm speaking to. I've had very good success with that with people, for example, Citrix engineers who I get on very well with, who kind of know that I know what I'm talking about and how things work a little bit. And I've also had the same conversations with other people more in governance who just don't really get it. And it is very, very much down to the personal relationships, I feel, and how much they trust you, how much you trust them, and just knowing their way of understanding the software. So if I know how to explain it in a way I know that person will understand, whereas if I don't really know them and I'm just kind of explaining it either too technically, and then they feel I'm sort of confusing them with jargon, or if it's not technical enough and they think I don't know what I'm talking about because I'm not being technical, it's very hard to gauge their, what strategy works for them in terms of their communication. You really have to have some familiarity with that person. It's not a transactional thing where you just provide a list of benefits and risks. It's very much how you communicate those, and to do that, you have to have that personal relationship with that person.
Yeah.
So I think interestingly, Colin's just put into the Zoom chat that it's taken several years for them, but they've now got a routine monthly meeting with their IT manager, with reps from IT and with reps from the physics team, and I think that's really what we've definitely try to achieve that kind of thing as well, that kind of organizational process where you've essentially got it. We sit in with the on the small change board, so we have a site over that, for example, so we can see what's happening for changes that are coming up. And I think having that kind of organized structure also does help as a long-term objective. So I think that's really good.
It's a really
I
useful
agree
thing
with-
to have. Sorry, Robert, on
Sorry,
you.
yes, no, I agree, Adam. That is a great strategy and something that I'm trying to get done. But it's bootstrapping it. It's you know, we have a safety group across the trust. Every system is meant to be represented on it, but they won't have radiotherapy be on it. And it's like I'm trying to push for that. It's like we are a system. You need to have us represented on there, and just trying to get that engagement and that buy-in from these senior executives who control who's on that board. It's proving more challenging than I'd anticipated.
Yeah, I think it's useful. One of the things we've noticed locally is that IT are definitely siloing their teams more into very distinct groups. And I think having those sort of routine meetings, it depends who that's going to be with, because quite often they might not have great relationships between those teams as well. It's a question of scale. I think if they're dealing with things across the entire trust, it's quite often that you'll go to meetings and nothing relevant comes up. Whereas for you, everything that you would take is obviously relevant for them. You're just a drop in the ocean, aren't you? So it can be economies of scale. I think one quick last question before we wrap up, and it's the general one that comes up whenever we all get together, is how does your IT look in your department compared to corporate IT? How much do you manage yourselves, and how much is managed by corporate IT? So we'll just do very briefly an idea of our own departments, and we'll go around the table. We'll start with you, Adam.
So we have our own VMware platform essentially, and we have a bunch of these hosted by IT. So we own servers, physical servers, but we don't own the networking. We don't own the higher level things, ADs, etc. So we have quite a lot that we are quite heavily dependent on IT, but we're not at the level where we have to fight for a new server to be deployed if we want to just create a virtualized one. So we have some advantage there.
We're much the same. We're sort of halfway house where we can manage VMs, but for networking it's through IT. And we don't have our own clients either. That was a big change for us, that we don't manage our own day-to-day personal computers. We use Citrix and virtualization for all of our software. Robert, do you want to go next?
So we're very sort of hands-off with IT. There's a clear distinction between IT and clinical and scientific computing. So basically all the infrastructure is managed by IT. And what we tend to deal with is things like scripting interfaces, new things coming in, new software, automating things on virtual servers, but we need to get those virtual servers from IT. We need to make a business case to IT and get those sorts of things, and working with IT, with vendors to put in new equipment, things like that. And it's something that hasn't really come up in this talk so far, but what we can do as well. I mean, I'm saying difficult getting engagement with the higher ups on some of this stuff, but the other part of that is that, you know, we don't have a computing department in radiotherapy. It's not like a, you know, the number of staff hours we have in physics to actually address all these things is limited as well, because obviously it's part of one role rather than having, you know, 4 full-time people working on it. So it sort of goes both ways as well, as that we don't put enough time and effort into achieving these goals, and that we're sort of very resource limited. And I think that does work both ways, and it does mean we don't have the resources to do things like manage our own VPNs or subnets or whatever else. We certainly couldn't manage Citrix servers because we just don't have the resources.
Thanks, Robert. And Jack, you similar?
So we're quite lucky in Leeds. So we've got in the radiotherapy technical services, or clinical engineering led department group within radiotherapy physics. They have a computing team that manages all the metal side of things. So we've got server rooms that we manage. They've got server rooms, all the Citrix side of things. We've also got agreements with our datacomms team to have a dedicated VLAN, virtual LAN, that we can then allocate IP addresses. Datacomms need to do the DNS entry, but we can allocate those IP addresses as we need to. And then in clinical scientific computing, we have the research infrastructure, so we can build virtual VMs on that research infrastructure quite freely within a research environment. So we're quite lucky to be as independent as we are, with the support of the radiotherapy technical services computing team.
Perfect, thanks, Jack. And I'll just wrap up there because we've just gone a couple of minutes over, but I'll just highlight a couple of upcoming events. So there is the IPEM Science, Technology and Engineering Forum, STEF, on Wednesday the 9th and Thursday the 10th of October. So registration's open for that. We also have registration open for Clinical Scientific Computing Symposium, which is on the 21st of November in Leeds. And the abstract deadline for that is tomorrow, I believe. So if you've got a good idea, get it in today or tomorrow. And apart from that, I'll just say thank you to Robert and Jack for joining in the discussion at the end there, and Adam for your presentation. It was really, really useful.